My name is Erica Jackson, and this is my final inquiry paper. I would like to start with my note to reader. In my note to reader, I just added that this draft has been edited several times by myself, my peers, and my professor, and I gave some insight on what the paper was going to be about and raised a question. Did you know forgiveness of the Nazi Germans is a controversial topic? And then I let the reader know the main purpose of this draft is to delve into an idea that is often seen as black and white. And the first major change I did to my paper was changing the title. Originally, it was How the Holocaust Affected Forgiveness. When Ms. Hoffman edited my paper, she let me know that my title wasn't as clear as it could be. Yes, it told what the paper was about, but it could be said just a little better. So I added the word willingness in there. So now it reads, How the Holocaust Affected the Willingness to Forgive. And this really sums up my paper very well, because the paper isn't just about forgiveness. It's about the idea of forgiveness changing and how that affected people's willingness to forgive or not forgive the Nazis. I started my paper with a quote from the Bible that reflects my view of forgiveness. It's pretty much the same as any Christian's idea of forgiveness would be, to forgive just as Jesus forgave, so over and over again and very willingly. So that's how I grew up, and I put that in my intro because that's what really made me so surprised that there were so many different beliefs about forgiveness. Some people say not to forgive, some people say to forgive, and there's a bunch of different reasons why people say to forgive or not to forgive. And I want to know why. Why was forgiveness after the Holocaust such a controversial topic, and why do certain people hold certain beliefs when it comes to the idea of forgiveness? Alright, so here's the paragraph where I talk about forgiveness, and originally I just had this quote right here kind of just plopped in there, and when I went back to edit, I added, this definition comes from an expert on the long-term coping patterns of Holocaust survivors. After collecting data and conducting studies, Sherry Hanchman defines forgiveness as stated above. I personally believe that this definition is the most relevant and true to the actual meaning of forgiveness. So instead of just plopping the quote in there, I said why I actually picked that quote, and I let my reader know kind of who wrote my source, and it's not just like a random person. It's actually someone, an expert on the topic, and that's done studies on it. So it is a relevant definition, and it is seen as correct. Also in this paragraph, I talked about the leaders in society and how it plays a role. And before, I kind of just mentioned that in the definition. I kind of just mentioned them in the definition. I didn't really say why it mattered. So in my final draft, I made sure to say why it mattered. So right here, I said I introduced my source again, and then I highlighted the main problem with forgiveness is the fact that some leaders are forcing unconditioned forgiveness from victims of major atrocities. And it basically just creates forces and tensions in between people after disasters, like either forgiving or not forgiving. So then, with all this coming into play, these are my ideas right here. Shouldn't forgiveness be healing for all after the Holocaust? Isn't it believed that forgiveness helps in the emotional healing process? Indeed, it seems this way, but there are several factors that have the potential to argue otherwise that are seen among Holocaust survivors and their families. Okay, in my third paragraph, I didn't really change much because I was kind of satisfied with it. I did add some info on my source. So I added who was conducting the studies and who came up with the types of survivors that I talked about. Because after this, I talk about the different kinds of survivors. And in this paragraph, I just added a little more details in my paragraph from the source. So just a little bit more support than I originally had before. Okay, in this paragraph, I go on to kind of explain the types of survivors. So one survivor I focused on was Gene Amory, and I put a quote in here from him that said, "Thus I am alone, as I was when they tortured me." And before, I had this quote plopped in like a lot of my other quotes, so it didn't really mean anything. But in my final, I added, from this excerpt, one can tell that Amory never fully recovered from the horrible events he experienced during the Holocaust. Most of Amory's writings were very dark and did not really have a positive point of view. And then I go on to say, anyone that reads his work can tell that Amory did not cope well with the aftermath of the Holocaust. And also another thing I added in here, in the beginning of the paragraph, what happened to Amory, and he was actually sent to Auschwitz, and I felt that played an important role because that lets you know what atrocities he went through, and that helps the reader understand and develops the type of victim, or the survivor, Amory is, which is a victim. So it kind of gives a better platform, and it makes it more of a rounder issue to understand, because it's not just black and white. This is what he went through, this is what happened, he didn't really cope well, and this is the outcome. And this next paragraph is actually an entirely new paragraph. It's one I wanted to add to contrast Jean Amory. It's about a survivor named Eva Kor. And I'm actually going to read it out loud because it is that important. Comparing the studies conducted by Green, Amory can be seen as a victim type. It is no surprise that someone of his nature would not be the one to forgive the Nazis of their wrongdoings. On the other hand, there exist survivors like Eva Kor. Eva Kor is a child survivor of the Holocaust who happened to be a twin. During the Holocaust, being a twin came with the dangers of harsh scientific experiments. A doctor named Mengele, who practiced at the concentration camp Auschwitz, performed horrible experiments on all twins that came across his path. And the sisters, like many of these twins, were subjected to torturous examinations, injections, and other genetic experiments. This quote came from an article posted by Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and are just some of the atrocities Kor and her sister endured. The difference between Kor and Amory is the fact that Eva mentally overcame what happened to her. How did she do this? She forgave. After the death of her sister, Kor appeared in front of an audience and publicly forgave the Nazi perpetrators. She received support for doing this, but she was also questioned and looked down upon. Eva exclaimed, "I discovered that I had the power to forgive. No one could give me that power and no one could take it away. It was all mine to use it in any way I wished." This quote parallels why Kor is seen as the fighter type. She took it upon herself to forgive the Nazis, and in the end it helped her in her healing process. She said that forgiving her perpetrators liberated her from her tragic past. Juxtaposed to Amory, one can see how how Kor's overall outlook on life affected her willingness to forgive. So this kind of adds voice to my paper. That was another thing I needed to do. So I added a voice of another survivor, and that would be Eva Kor. And I explained a lot with it, and I kind of compared it to Amory, and I felt that was really important because I talked about the victim type, but I also talked about the fighter type. So that's two different views, and it's two different valid views that people do believe and people do hold still today. Okay, continuing on in my paper, I bring up the point of third-party forgiveness. And before I had a quote in here, kind of just plopped in, but it's another voice in my paper, so I wanted to keep it in, so I just described what the quote was. And I said this view comes from another victim-type survivor like Amory. And I related it back to Amory because that was an important topic we already talked about, and it made it more relevant to my paper. And I defined third-party forgiveness and told the idea about it. Basically, for the Nazis to be fully forgiven, every victim of the Holocaust would essentially have to forgive the perpetrators. This thought is impossible because the main victims of the Holocaust are mostly dead. And this topic brought up some questions in my mind, mostly with if this view is fair or not. If this is one's thought process, essentially the Nazis will never fully be forgiven, simply because no one can raise people from the dead. Is this view fair to the Nazi Germans and their descendants? It's hard to say because the issue is not black and white. However, the next thing I delve into could potentially hold the answer. So, actually, kind of connecting this reason for not forgiving the Nazis because they never actually said sorry, putting my ideas here at the end of the paragraph created the perfect segue into my next topic I'm going to talk about. And it really tied my paper in instead of just having kind of information from the source, but I finally got to put some of my actual input. And so this is the last point of my paper, and before this paragraph was kind of elementary. The issue was a little oversimplified. I started my paragraph saying the last point I want to focus on is the fact that the Nazis never said sorry. That was, like I said, too oversimplified. So I changed it to the last point I want to focus on is the fact that in order for forgiveness to be genuine, repentance from the offending party is needed. And in history, not many Germans said sorry for what they did. And I pulled in how the Dr. Mengele that operated on Eva Kor, he never even faced trial. And a lot of the big leaders in the Holocaust, they never really were punished. So the idea for that is if the victim, so the person needed to be doing the forgiving, if the victim also believes retribution must be offered before forgiveness, forgiveness cannot be achieved. So basically, it would be the idea is that the victims, they would say, well, the Nazis never said sorry to me, and so I can't forgive them. So that's basically what this is saying. And I compared it to Eva Kor. In the case of Eva Kor, she was able to offer forgiveness without the meaningful repentance of her perpetrators. Jean Amory, on the other hand, would be a survivor who would require direct apologies from his perpetrators. Even then, it is hard to determine if some survivors and their family would offer forgiveness. So I added that in there just so you can kind of see how it plays in real life. So you can see how, on one hand, Eva Kor was able to forgive without any public apology or anything, but Amory, on the other hand, along with other survivors, just believed that they didn't deserve forgiveness because they never apologized and they weren't sorry. And that was really big for a bunch of survivors. Like, it scarred them, and it was really hard for them to get over that. And I just added a little conclusion here to tie everything up. In conclusion, the idea of forgiveness after the Holocaust is not a black and white issue. There are many different factors which come into play that determines one's willingness to forgive. Victim type, sex, belief, and upbringing all come into play when delving into forgiveness after the Holocaust. It is important to remember that everyone deals with things differently, especially after life-changing disasters like the Holocaust. And my last sentence is kind of like a call to why my paper is important. Because we do see events like the Holocaust and the genocide in Africa, things like that, and it really does alter forgiveness, and it's important to evaluate how people deal with these things so we can help it in the future. So I wanted to add that in my paper because it kind of just summed everything up and told the reader why it was important. They just didn't read a bunch of nonsense. It was actually for a purpose. And thank you.